darkness, knowledge emerges.
I was on ration duty when the sky changed color. It happened during the third bell of morning shift, when the hive's artificial dawn should have been bleeding its usual rust orange through the atmospheric processors. Instead, the light filtering through the high observation ports turned purple. Not the purple of imperial banners or ecclesiastical vestments, but something sickly, wrong, like bruised flesh stretched across the heavens. I stood at my distribution station in Hab Block Septimus, surrounded by the usual morning crush of workers waiting for their daily allotment. The gruel was the same grey paste it had always been, dispensed from corroded spigots that wheezed with every pour. The crowd was the same tired mass of humanity, gaunt faces, oil-stained clothing, eyes that had learned not to hope for anything beyond survival until the next shift. Everything was exactly as it had been for the 17 years I'd served the administratum in this capacity. Everything except the sky. The workers noticed it too. Conversations died mid-word. Heads turned upward, tracking the light's transformation through the reinforced glass panels that separated us from the hive's exterior atmosphere. The purple deepened, pulsing with rhythms that suggested something breathing, something alive pressing against the barrier between void and air. "Atmospheric aberration," announced Senior Clerk Vordin from his elevated podium. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone reading from approved documentation. "The administratum has classified this phenomenon as within acceptable parameters. Distribution will continue without interruption. The Emperor protects." But I saw his hands. I saw the way they trembled as they gripped the data slate, the way his quill scratched across parchment with irregular pressure that suggested fear more than routine. The report he stamped bore the administratum's seal of verification, but the wax was applied too heavily, as if he were trying to press the words into truth through sheer physical force. The workers returned to their queues, but the silence remained. They collected their rations without the usual murmurs of complaint about portion size or quality. They ate mechanically, swallowing without tasting, their eyes repeatedly drawn back to the corrupted sky. I ladled gruel into bowls and watched them leave, their shoulders hunched as if anticipating a blow from above. The phenomenon persisted through the entire shift. No natural storm behaved this way. Storms moved, evolved, eventually passed. This remained constant, a purple membrane stretched across our world like skin covering a wound. The atmospheric processors continued their mechanical breathing, but their rhythm seemed strained, laboring against pressure that had nothing to do with wind or temperature. By mid-shift, the first rumors reached our distribution center. They came in whispers passed between workers during the brief moments when overseers weren't watching, in the sideways glances exchanged when ration bowls touched during collection. "Outer districts," someone murmured behind me as I refilled the gruel vats. "People disappearing." "Families," another voice added. "Entire Hab blocks reporting for shift and never arriving. The enforcers are silencing anyone who asks questions, threatening penal labor for spreading unverified information." I kept ladling, kept distributing, kept maintaining the fiction that everything was proceeding according to standard protocol. But I listened, and I felt something else, something that had nothing to do with rumors or official dismissals. Pressure. It pressed against my skull like hands testing the strength of a container. It filled my lungs with each breath, making the recycled air feel thick, substantial, as if atmosphere itself were becoming more than mere gas. The sensation was not physical pain, it was awareness. The awareness of being observed, of standing beneath a tension so vast and alien that human consciousness registered it only as pressure, as weight, as the presence of something enormous drawing closer with each passing moment. I had felt this once before, years ago, when I witnessed an execution. The condemned man had stood on the scaffold while the crowd gathered, and in that moment before the noose tightened, I had felt the weight of collective attention focused on a single point. The anticipation, the hunger for completion. This felt similar, but magnified beyond comprehension. Not hundreds watching one man die, something watching all of us, counting us, measuring us, assessing us with cold, methodical intelligence that saw through flesh and bone to catalogue what we were made of, what we contained, what use we might serve. Not as people, as biomass. The thought arrived unbidden, and with it came nausea so intense I had to grip the edge of the distribution counter to remain upright. Biomass. raw material, protein and minerals and organic compounds waiting to be reclaimed, processed, consumed. Are you unwell? Vordin's voice cut through the fog. He stood beside me, his data slate clutched like a shield against his chest. If you require Medicae attention, I'm functional, I said, forcing my voice to steadiness. The atmospheric aberration is affecting concentration. He nodded too quickly, too eagerly accepting an explanation that allowed him to avoid deeper questions. Maintain your station. The phenomenon will pass. All aberrations pass. The administratum has confirmed this is within documented parameters. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted to the purple sky visible through the observation ports, then away, then back again with the compulsive fear of someone checking to see if a predator still watched. He knew, as I knew, as every person in that distribution center knew on some instinctual level, the Imperium's conditioning could not fully suppress that this was not within any parameters. That whatever caused the sky to bruise purple was not atmospheric, not natural, not something that would simply pass. The shift ended. I filed my reports with the appropriate authorities, each document stamped and sealed and added to archives that would never be fully read. Production numbers, distribution efficiency, resource allocation. All the endless paperwork that allowed the administratum to maintain the comforting fiction that documentation created control, that if everything was properly logged and filed, then reality itself would conform to bureaucratic order. I walked home through corridors that smelled of industrial lubricant and human sweat, past propaganda posters proclaiming the Emperor's eternal protection, past shrine alcoves where workers paused to murmur brief prayers before continuing to their hab units. The lumen strips flickered with power fluctuations that maintenance servitors would log as within acceptable variance. Everything was within acceptable variance. Everything was proceeding according to protocol. But that night, as I lay on my narrow cot in my assigned quarters, I felt the tremors. They were subtle vibrations transmitted through ferrocrete and metal, rhythmic pulses that suggested footsteps. But no human footfall could cause the entire hive structure to resonate. No army's march could create tremors that arrived with such precise, inevitable rhythm. These felt like something vast approaching. Something hungry, something that had counted us and found the number acceptable for its purposes. I pressed my hands against the wall and felt the vibrations travel through metal and bone and flesh, felt them settle in my teeth like the memory of chewing, like the anticipation of a meal. The sky remained purple through my quarter's single viewport, and somewhere beyond that corrupted atmosphere, beyond the hive's armored shell, something drew closer with patient, methodical intent. We were being counted. Not as citizens of the Imperium, not as servants of the God Emperor, not as individuals with names and histories and hopes, as biomass, as fuel, as nothing more than organic material waiting to be reclaimed by something that existed only to consume. I did not sleep that night. None of us did. Though the administratum would never document it, though no official report would ever acknowledge it, every soul in that hive lay awake beneath a purple sky and felt the breath of something enormous drawing closer. The devouring had not yet begun, but we had already been measured for harvest. The orders arrived 3 days after the sky changed. They came through the standard channel's Vox transmission to the administratum's central hub, then distributed via data courier to every production facility, manufactorum, and processing center in the hive. I received mine during morning briefing, a single sheet of parchment bearing the Departamento Munitorum's seal and a directive so absurd it would have been laughable under any other circumstances. Production quotas increased by 40% across all sectors, effective immediately. Munitions output to be doubled within 5 rotation cycles. Failure to meet targets will result in reclassification of personnel to penal labor battalions. The Emperor protects. 40%. The number sat in my skull like a tumor. Our facilities already operated at maximum capacity, workers pulling double shifts until exhaustion caused accidents that the overseers documented as operator error rather than systemic failure. The machinery ancient, poorly maintained, held together by prayer and the diminishing patience of increasingly erratic machine spirits could barely sustain current output levels. Doubling munitions production was not ambitious, it was impossible. But the administratome does not recognize impossibility. It recognizes only compliance and failure carried consequences that made death seem merciful. I watched Senior Overseer Grath read the directive to the assembly of shift managers and production coordinators. His voice never wavered, never acknowledged the mathematical absurdity of what he was ordering. He simply read the words as if reading them made them achievable, as if the Imperium's bureaucratic authority could override the physical limitations of machinery and human endurance. "Questions?" he asked when he finished. Silence, not because there were no questions, but because asking them invited attention, and attention from the overseers had become increasingly dangerous. I had watched 3 coordinators disappear in the past week, reassigned to unspecified duties after questioning production metrics that made no logical sense. Their names were struck from rosters as efficiently as their bodies were removed from the premises. "Then return to your stations," Grath said. "And remember, the Emperor judges by results, not excuses." We dispersed. I returned to my administrative station in the munitions assembly sector, surrounded by the perpetual thunder of machinery and the chemical stench of propellant compounds. The workers were already at their stations when I arrived, faces grey with fatigue, hands moving with mechanical precision born from years of repetitive labor. I began processing the quota adjustments, translating the Departamento Monitorum's demands into shift schedules and resource allocations that had no basis in reality. Each form I stamped was a quiet lie, a document pretending that human bodies could be pushed beyond their breaking points through sheer administrative will. My hands shook as I worked. Not from fear, though. Fear was certainly present, but from the terrible knowledge of what these orders meant. The Imperium was not trying to increase production because it believed we could meet these quotas. It was extracting every possible resource before something happened that would make resource extraction impossible. This was not preparation for victory. This was liquidation of assets before total loss. By mid-shift, the brutality began. I heard it before I saw it, the wet crack of a shock mole connecting with flesh, followed by a scream that cut through even the machinery's roar. I looked up from my data slate to see Overseer Venn standing over a collapsed worker, his maul raised for another strike. "Efficiency decreased by 0.3%, Venn announced to the assembly floor. "Unacceptable. Production quotas require maximum output. Weakness will not be tolerated." He brought the maul down again. The worker, a man I recognized as Hebron, 17 years of service, 3 children in the lower hab blocks, tried to raise his arms in defense. The maul shattered his forearm. The crack echoed like breaking pottery. No one moved to help him. No one protested. We had all learned that intervention only added names to the casualty reports. Hebron was dragged away by servitors, his broken arm trailing at an angle that made my stomach turn. He would be processed through the Medicaid facility, assigned a disability classification, and either returned to lighter duties or reclassified as unproductive biomass suitable for corpse starch processing. The machinery never stopped. The other workers kept their eyes on their tasks, hands moving with renewed speed born from terror rather than enthusiasm. Production efficiency increased immediately. Fear is an excellent motivator in the short term, even if it guarantees collapse in the long term. But there was no long term. Not anymore. The overseers knew it. The administratum knew it. Perhaps even the workers knew it, though they could not articulate what their instincts screamed. We were not producing ammunition to win a war. We were producing it to delay acknowledgement that the war was already lost. The beatings continued throughout the shift. Workers who stumbled from exhaustion, workers whose machinery malfunctioned, workers who simply failed to meet the impossible metrics that overseers enforced with escalating violence. The floor became slick with blood and industrial lubricant, both fluids mixing into a paste that servitors scraped away during the brief intervals between shifts. I stamped forms, documented injuries as acceptable losses within projected parameters, filed reports that transformed human suffering into numerical data that higher authorities would scan briefly before discarding. Each document was complicity, each stamp an acknowledgement that I was participating in systematic brutalization because the alternative was joining the victims. At night cycle, I filed the day's production reports with hands that would not stop shaking. The numbers were impressive, quotas met or exceeded across multiple sectors. On parchment, we were succeeding. In reality, we were consuming ourselves like a body devouring its own muscle tissue to survive starvation. I walked home through corridors that now carried new sounds, the distant discharge of weapons from the outer districts, the wail of sirens that announced curfew violations, the mechanical grinding of automated defenses activating. The Planetary Defense Force had mobilized early, though no official announcement explained why. Troop transports rumbled through primary thoroughfares at all hours, armored checkpoints appeared overnight, heavy weapons emplacements were installed on the upper levels. Their barrels pointed not inward at potential insurgents but outward, toward threats that existed beyond the Hive's armored shell. No one dared ask why. Asking invited attention, and attention had become synonymous with disappearance. The rumors spread anyway, whispered in the brief moments when surveillance was assumed to be minimal during shift changes, in communal lavatories, in the cramped sleeping quarters where workers collapsed after 16-hour production cycles. Something's coming. The governor mobilized the entire PDF 3 weeks early. They're stockpiling ammunition like they're expecting a siege. Not a siege, something worse. I tried not to listen. Tried to maintain the professional detachment the administratum cultivated in its servants, but the rumors burrowed into consciousness like parasites, feeding on the fear that official denials could not suppress. That night, the tremors returned. I felt them through my cot's thin mattress, rhythmic pulses that traveled through ferrocrete and metal with increasing frequency. They were stronger now, more distinct. Not the vague sense of something distant approaching, but the definite sensation of something enormous drawing nearer with each passing day. I pressed my ear against the wall and heard it clearly, a sound like thunder, but regular, methodical, like footsteps, like something walking toward us with patient, inevitable purpose. The sound resonated in my teeth, in my bones, in the deepest parts of my body that existed before the administratum taught me to think in quotas and efficiency metrics. The parts that remembered humanity was prey before it became predator, that knew the sensation of being hunted by things larger and hungrier than ourselves. I lay awake and felt the tremors continue through the night, each pulse a reminder that something vast approached. Something that saw our frantic production increases and our desperate fortification efforts and our pathetic violence against our own exhausted workers, not as deterrence but as confirmation. Confirmation that we knew. That despite all the official denials and the bureaucratic lies and the propaganda assuring us the Emperor protected, we knew what was coming. We were being devoured from the inside by our own brutality, consuming ourselves in a futile effort to prepare for consumption by something else. The overseers beat workers to meet quotas that served no purpose except to create the illusion of control. The administratum stamped forms that documented our systematic self-destruction as if documentation made it meaningful. The PDF mobilized weapons that would prove as relevant as children's toys against what approached. And through it all, the tremors continued, growing stronger, growing closer. The footsteps of something hungry, counting us with each step. Not as soldiers, not as defenders, not as citizens of the Imperium, as biomass, as fuel, as a harvest waiting to be reaped. I closed my eyes and felt the tremors pulse through flesh and bone, and I knew with terrible certainty that no quota would save us, no amount of ammunition would matter, no brutality we inflicted on ourselves would compare to what was coming. We were already counted, already measured. The devouring had not yet begun, but we could feel its appetite in the earth itself. The audit request came on the 7th day after the sky changed. It was routine paperwork at least. It wore the appearance of routine. The administratum required quarterly inspections of the outer fortifications to verify structural integrity and resource allocation. I had conducted these audits dozens of times over the years, walking the bulwarks with a data slate and a bored engineer, documenting measurements that no one would ever review. But this time felt different. The request came with unusual urgency, stamped with priority seals that suggested someone higher in the hierarchy actually cared about the results. And it assigned me specifically by name and designation number, rather than simply dispatching whichever coordinator happened to be available. Someone wanted documentation. Official, stamped, sealed documentation that could be filed away and referenced later when questions were asked about who knew what and when they knew it. I took the transit hauler to the outer districts in early morning, before the day shift filled the corridors with human traffic. The vehicle rumbled through tunnels that grew progressively older as we moved away from the Hive's central core, ferrocrete giving way to rockcrete, giving way to bare stone reinforced with corroded metal supports. The lumen strips became sporadic, creating pools of shadow between islands of failing light. The other passengers' workers assigned to perimeter maintenance and defense installations sat in silence. Their faces carried the grey exhaustion I had grown accustomed to seeing, but something else had been added. A tightness around the eyes. A way of holding their bodies as if bracing for impact. They knew something. Or suspected something. Or felt something that instinct recognized even if conscious thought refused to name it. We reached the outer bulwarks as the purple sky completed its transition from false dawn to sickly daylight. Engineer Adept Krell met me at the checkpoint, his augmetic eye clicking through focus modes as he scanned my credentials. He was old, 60 years at least, his organic parts heavily supplemented with replacement systems that wheezed and clicked with each movement. The fortifications, he said without preamble, are within acceptable parameters according to all official documentation. The way he emphasized official documentation told me everything I needed to know about what we were about to see. We walked the ramparts in silence, our boots echoing on metal walkways suspended above defensive ditches filled with razor wire and automated gun emplacements. The walls rose 30 meters above us, massive structures of reinforced rockcrete studded with weapons, ports, and surveillance equipment. They had stood for centuries, protecting the Hive from tribal raiders and industrial accidents and the occasional zealot uprising. They were supposed to be eternal. Monuments to Imperial engineering and the invincibility of proper construction protocols. They were cracking. Not superficial damage, not the expected weathering from atmospheric exposure or the minor settling that all structures experienced. These were fundamental fractures, deep fissures that ran through the rockcrete like veins, like the walls themselves were developing a circulatory system of failure. I stopped at the first major crack and measured it with the equipment Krell provided, 3 centimeters wide at the surface, deepening as it penetrated into the structure. I could see darkness inside the fissure, could hear air moving through spaces that should not exist. The crack extended vertically for at least 10 meters, branching into smaller fractures that suggested the damage was spreading, growing, consuming the wall's integrity from within. When did this appear? I asked, already documenting the measurements on my data slate. Krell's augmetic eye rotated to focus on the crack. 17 days ago, initially measured at 0.3 centimeters, current width represents acceleration beyond projected degradation models. 17 days. Before the sky changed, before the tremors, before any of us consciously recognized what was approaching, the walls had known first. We continued the inspection, finding similar damage at regular intervals. Cracks. Fractures. Places where the rockcrete had developed a texture like diseased flesh, crumbling at the touch, releasing dust that smelled faintly of rot despite being inorganic material. Support struts showed stress fractures. Weapons emplacements sat slightly askew, their mounting brackets failing under weight they had supported without issue for decades. Repairs? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Proceeding according to protocol, Krell said. His voice carried no inflection, no conviction. Resources have been allocated, work crews are addressing critical damage points, progress is being documented for administratum review. But his face was pale beneath the augmetics. His organic hand trembled slightly as he gestured toward a repair crew working on a collapsed section of rampart. They worked in near silence, welding fresh metal supports and pouring quick-setting rockcrete into gaps that seemed to widen even as they filled them. Their movements carried the futility of people performing tasks they knew were meaningless, maintaining the ritual of labor because the alternative was acknowledging hopelessness. We descended into the wall's interior maintenance tunnels, following passages that wound through the fortification's guts like intestines. The air was thick here, heavy with moisture and chemical stench from the atmospheric processes. Emergency lumen strips provided minimal illumination, casting everything in red that made the cracks seem like wounds bleeding shadow. The Vox relays were the worst part. They lined the tunnels at regular intervals, ancient communication equipment that connected the outer defenses to the Hive's command infrastructure. They should have been silent, or emitting the standard carrier tone that indicated active readiness. Instead, they screamed. Not loudly, these were quiet screams, the sound of machine spirits in distress, static that formed patterns almost like language, oscillations that suggested something trying to communicate through channels designed for human speech. I approached one relay and listened to its output, feeling my skin crawl as the static resolved into something that might have been words, might have been warnings, might have been the technological equivalent of terror. "The machine spirits," I said carefully, "appear to be malfunctioning." Krell made a gesture that might have been the sign of the Mechanicus, his augmetic components clicking in what could have been prayer or malfunction. They detect something. Beyond the walls. Beyond standard sensor range. Something that interferes with their sacred function, that corrupts their communion with the Omnissiah's mysteries. Can they be repaired? They are not broken. His organic eye met mine, and I saw genuine fear there. They are responding appropriately to stimuli we lack the capacity to perceive. The machine spirits see what we cannot, and what they see terrifies them. We completed the inspection as the day cycle reached its midpoint. I documented everything with meticulous detail, the cracks, the degradation, the structural failures that were accelerating beyond any rational explanation. I recorded the measurements that proved the walls were failing under their own weight, that the fortifications designed to last millennia were crumbling after mere centuries. But I did not document the real truth. The truth that had nothing to do with engineering failures or material degradation. The walls were not failing because they were old or poorly maintained. They were failing because something on the other side was pressing against them. Not physically, there were no impacts, no siege weapons, no visible assault, but pressure nonetheless. The pressure of attention, of hunger, of something enormous, focusing its will upon the barriers that separated it from what it desired. The walls knew they could not hold. And so they were giving up, crumbling before the assault even began, surrendering to inevitability with the passive resignation of matter acknowledging superior force. As I stood on the ramparts, preparing to return to the central hive, I looked outward toward the wastelands beyond the fortifications. The purple sky stretched to the horizon, pulsing with rhythms that had become almost familiar. But something else caught my attention, movement in the distance. Clouds, but clouds that moved against the wind. I watched them drift across the wasteland, massive formations that swarmed and coalesced and separated with purpose rather than meteorological randomcy. They moved like living things, like flocks, like swarms with collective intelligence directing their motion toward a single destination, toward us. "Do you see them?" I asked Krell, pointing toward the horizon. His augmetic eye extended on its mounting, focusing at maximum range. The organic side of his face went completely white. "I see nothing," he said quietly. "There is nothing to see. The horizon is clear. This will be documented as such. But there is nothing." He turned away from the ramparts, his augmetic components whirring with stress. "Your audit is complete. The walls are within acceptable parameters. Repairs are proceeding according to protocol. All findings will be filed with appropriate authorities. The Emperor protects." He walked away, his footsteps unsteady, leaving me alone on the ramparts with my data slate full of lies and my eyes full of truth. The clouds continued their approach, silent, patient, inevitable. I felt the pressure then, stronger than ever before. Not just observation, recognition. The thing approaching knew we saw it, knew we understood what was coming, and it did not care. Our knowledge changed nothing. Our crumbling walls and screaming machine spirits and desperate denials were all equally irrelevant. We had been measured, counted, assessed with cold precision, and the walls that were supposed to protect us were already surrendering, cracking under the weight of something that desired everything we were, everything we contained, everything we could be rendered down into. I returned to the central hive and filed my report, documented the cracks as within projected degradation parameters, stamped the forms that said repairs were proceeding adequately, added my false testimony to the archives of lies that the administratum would reference when seeking to assign blame for the inevitable catastrophe. That night, I heard the stone groan. Deep beneath my HAB unit, transmitted through kilometers of rock and metal and human construction, I heard the planet itself respond to what approached. A sound like protest, like the Earth recognizing it was about to be wounded in ways that went beyond surface damage. The tremors had evolved, They were no longer distant footsteps, they were present, close, the breathing of something enormous that had arrived at our walls and found them acceptable for its purposes, not as obstacles, as temporary barriers before feeding. I pressed my hands against the floor and felt the vibrations, felt the planet's distress, felt the certainty that stone and metal and desperate human engineering would provide no protection from what had come. The walls would not hold. They had never been able to hold. And everyone who built them had known it. On some level, the Imperium's conditioning could not fully suppress. We had simply been pretending otherwise, maintaining the ritual of defense, because acknowledging futility was more terrifying than false hope. The devouring was coming, and the only question remaining was how long the pretense would continue before reality devoured it too. The evacuation order came without warning. I was processing morning reports when the vox horns erupted throughout the hive, their blast so sudden and loud that half the workers at their stations dropped their tools in shock. The message repeated in the flat, emotionless cadence of automated systems no human authority wanted to be associated with what was being announced. All non-essential personnel are to proceed immediately to designated refuge zones. Bring only what can be carried. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will be met with lethal force. The Emperor protects. Non-essential, the word hung in the recycled air like poison. It meant everyone except the defense force, the overseers, the administratum coordinators required to maintain documentation until the final moment. It meant the workers, the families, the children, the elderly, the injured. Everyone who could not contribute to the hive's last desperate gestures of resistance. It meant millions of souls crammed into spaces designed for thousands, buried deep beneath the hive where the administratum believed they might survive whatever was coming. It meant tombs prepared for the living. I grabbed my data slate and joined the tide of humanity flowing toward the designated refuge zones. The corridors became rivers of flesh, people pressed so tightly together that movement was collective rather than individual. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of fierce sweat, of the particular stench that humans emit when they know death is close but cannot see its face. Children cried. Not the loud wailing of normal distress, but quiet, confused whimpering. They sensed their parents' terror and absorbed it, becoming silent and wide-eyed, clutching threadbare toys and worn blankets, as if these objects could protect them from what approached. The elderly moved with grim acceptance, their faces carrying the exhausted resignation of those who had survived too long, who had witnessed too many of the Imperium's promises revealed as lies. They shuffled forward because stopping meant being trampled, because the crowd's momentum was irresistible, because there was nowhere else to go. And the workers, my colleagues, the people I had processed rations for and filed reports about and stamped documents concerning, they carried their pathetic treasures, picked captures of deceased family members, holy texts worn smooth from desperate reading, children's drawings, wedding bands, medals from decades of loyal service. All the small proofs of individual existence that they clutched as if possessing these objects could preserve the meaning they represented. We descended. Down through levels I had never visited, through passages carved from raw stone rather than constructed with ferrocrete, following routes marked with crude directional symbols painted in fading luminescent paint. The temperature rose as we went deeper, the hive's cooling systems inadequate for the crush of human bodies generating heat in confined spaces. The refuge caves had been prepared in advance, that much was obvious. Someone in the administratum hierarchy had known this moment would come, had allocated resources to excavating these chambers and stocking them with minimal supplies. But they had not prepared adequately, had not wanted to acknowledge how many would need shelter, had not wanted to allocate resources that might be needed for the defense effort, had not wanted to confront the mathematical reality that the caves could never hold everyone. The entrance to my designated zone was a crude arch carved through living rock, marked with the identifier Refuge Delta 7 in High Gothic script. Administratum monitors stood on either side, checking designation codes and directing people inward with shock mauls when verbal commands proved insufficient. I showed my credentials. The monitor, a woman whose face bore the parallel scars of facial augmetics that had been removed, leaving only the trauma, scanned my data slate and gestured toward the entrance. Maximum capacity reached 3 hours ago, she said without inflection. Continue to assigned sector, maintain order. Violence against administratum personnel will result in summary execution. I entered and immediately understood what she meant. The cave was vast, perhaps 100 meters across, with a ceiling lost in darkness above emergency lumen strips that provided barely enough light to prevent complete blindness. And it was full. Not crowded full, packed with humanity pressed together like cargo, like the corpse starch processing facilities where bodies were rendered down into edible paste. The air was already thick, hot, stinking of sweat and urine, and the beginning stages of panic. People sat on bare stone, on thin mats if they were fortunate enough to have brought them, on nothing at all if they were not. Families clustered together, adults forming protective circles around children who sat motionless in the centers, their eyes reflecting the inadequate light. The elderly occupied whatever spaces they could claim, some already lying down, conserving energy for an ordeal whose duration no one could predict. Prayer filled the air. Whispered supplications to the God Emperor, mumbled verses from the Imperial creed, desperate bargaining with a deity who had never demonstrated interest in individual survival. The words blended into a constant murmur, a sonic texture that suggested desperation more than faith. Incense burned in small censers, personal possessions brought from shrine alcoves, as if the scent of sanctified smoke could purify air already growing foul. The smoke hung in layers, unable to disperse in the still atmosphere, creating horizontal bands of grey that stung the eyes and coated the throat. I found a space near the cave's rear wall, between a family of 5 and an elderly man who clutched a book of scripture and rocked slowly back and forth. I sat, feeling the stone's coldness seep through my administratum robes, and tried to process the reality of what was happening. We were being buried alive. Not killed, that would have been more merciful. We were being stored, warehoused, filed away like documents deemed too important to destroy but too problematic to keep accessible. The administratum was preserving biomass for whatever came after, assuming there would be an after, assuming something would survive to make use of the raw material we represented. Hours passed. More people arrived, forced into spaces that should not have accommodated them, pushed deeper into the cave by monitors who struck anyone who resisted. The crowd became denser, tighter, until breathing required conscious effort, until the heat became almost unbearable despite the stone's coolness. Children stopped crying. They sat in silence, their faces blank with shock, their small bodies pressed against parents who could offer no comfort beyond physical proximity. Some slept, exhausted by fear. Others stared at nothing, their minds already retreating to places where the reality of confinement could not reach them. A woman near me tried to calm her infant, rocking it gently while murmuring a lullaby in a language I did not recognize, something ancient, passed down through generations, surviving longer than any imperial doctrine. The baby did not cry, simply stared upward with enormous eyes, as if it could see through stone and metal and atmosphere to whatever approached from above. The monitors maintained order through presence and threat. They stood at intervals throughout the cave, their shock moles visible, their faces hard with the professional cruelty of those who had accepted that compassion was obsolete. When someone tried to push toward the entrance, seeking escape or simply air that did not taste like fear, the monitors struck them down and dragged them back into the crowd. No one was permitted to leave. The refuge was not optional. It was mandatory storage of Imperial resources until such time as those resources might be useful again. If there was a such time. I sat against the stone and felt the vibrations. They were constant now, no longer occasional tremors but continuous oscillation, as if the planet itself shook with fear. The sensation traveled through rock and into bone, creating resonance in my skull that made thought difficult, made consciousness feel fragile, made the boundary between self and environment seem permeable. And beneath the vibrations, I heard something else. A sound so deep it was almost subsonic, felt more than heard. A groan that came from the stone itself, from the planet's crust, from the very matter we crouched upon. It was the sound of Earth protesting, of rock recognizing it was about to be violated in ways geology had never prepared it for. The planet knew. As the walls had known. As the machine spirits had known. The matter itself recognized what approached and responded with the closest thing to fear that inorganic substance could express. Night cycle came artificial designation, meaningless in caves without natural light, but maintained by the administratum's chronometers because maintaining schedules provided the illusion of order. The lumen strips dimmed to conserve power, plunging the cave into near darkness broken only by the faint glow of personal devices and the embers of burning incense. In the darkness, the fear became palpable. Not metaphorical, actually tangible, thick in the air like smoke, coating the inside of lungs with each breath. People wept quietly, trying not to disturb others, trying to maintain the pretense of dignity, even as dignity became impossible. Some prayed louder, their voices rising in desperation. Others fell silent, retreating into whatever internal spaces could still provide shelter when physical shelter had become a lie. I closed my eyes and felt the stone groan beneath me, felt the planet's distress transmitted through kilometers of rock, felt the certainty that no depth would be sufficient, no thickness of stone would provide protection, no amount of burial would hide us from what searched. Because it was not searching with eyes or sensors or anything that stone could block, it was searching with hunger, with need, with the fundamental awareness that biomass existed here, that organic material waited to be claimed, that a harvest stood ready. And hunger, I understood in that moment of clarity, could not be stopped by walls or distance or desperate prayer. Hunger found what it sought, always. The smell of fear intensified throughout the night. Fear and sweat and the beginning stages of waste as people lost control of bodies pushed beyond endurance. The refugees pressed together in darkness, breathing air that grew thicker with each passing hour, and waited for whatever came next. Deep beneath the hive, deep beneath stone that groaned its protests, deep beneath illusions of safety that even the administratum no longer believed. We waited in our tomb, surrounded by the smell of fear, and knew that depth was not safety. It was simply delay. The devouring would find us. It was already looking. The first patrol did not return. I learned this 3 days into our confinement, when an administratum courier arrived with updated status reports that I was required to process despite our situation. The document was brief, clinically phrased in the bureaucratic language designed to drain horror from fact. Patrol Unit Epsilon 1-2, stationed at Perimeter Zone 7 Delta, failed to report at designated interval. Communication attempts unsuccessful. Unit reclassified as unverified biosignatures pending investigation. Standard protocols remain in effect. Unverified biosignatures. The administratum's sterile term for probably dead but we cannot confirm because investigating would require sending more people to die. But the courier's hands shook as he delivered the report, and his eyes carried knowledge that no amount of bureaucratic language could conceal something had happened to Epsilon 1-2. Something that made even hardened administratum functionaries afraid to speak plainly. More reports followed over the next hours. Other patrols, other units stationed near the outer ruins where the hive's territory met the wasteland, all gone silent, all reclassified with the same empty phrase that meant everything and admitted nothing. The patterns were consistent. Patrols disappeared during twilight cycles, during the transitional periods when the purple sky shifted from sickly dayglow to deeper bruised darkness. They reported normally up until their final scheduled transmission, then simply ceased. No distress calls, no weapons fire detected by surveillance systems, no evidence of struggle. They were there. Then they were not, as if something had erased them. On the 4th day, a patrol returned. Only one man out of a squad of 12. He staggered into the inner checkpoint at the refuge zone entrance, his uniform torn, his face so pale it looked like parchment stretched over skull. The monitors brought him directly to my station. Procedure required that all returning personnel be documented before receiving medical attention, that paperwork take precedence over mercy. I had known him. Trooper Vex, 14 years of service, competent if unremarkable. He had once shared guard duty outside my administrative office, had accepted recaf I offered during long night shifts, had shown me picked captures of his daughter who worked in the textile manufactorums. What sat across from me now barely resembled that man. "Report," I said, activating my recording stylus. "Patrol Unit Gamma 9, Perimeter Zone 4 Alpha. You failed to return at scheduled time. Explain your delay." Vex stared at me, his eyes too wide, his pupils dilated despite the lumen strip's brightness. His mouth worked silently for several moments before sound emerged. "Shapes," he whispered, "in the ruins. Moving too fast. Wrong angles. We saw them in the shadows between the buildings, skittering across surfaces that should not support weight. Sergeant Hulk ordered visual confirmation. We approached standard formation, weapons ready, by the protocols. His voice trailed off. I waited, stylus poised, aware that the other monitors were listening, that this testimony would become official record. They were not shadows, Vex continued, his voice rising slightly. They were in the shadows, moving through darkness like it was water. Faster than anything that size should move. We opened fire. Las bolts hit them, burned through chitin or hide or whatever they were made of, and they kept coming. Hulk went down first. Something took him from above, dropped from a ruin's upper level, and just pulled him apart. Not killed him, dismantled him, deliberately. We heard him screaming while it happened. How many hostiles? I asked, maintaining procedural detachment even as my hands began trembling. I don't know. Dozens? Hundreds? They moved too fast to count, blending with the ruins, with the darkness. We fell back. Lost Mirren and Kos in the retreat. Something pulled them through a gap in the rubble that was too small for human bodies, but they went through anyway, compressed, broken, screaming. I ran. I ran. He started crying then, tears flowing silently down his grey face. They let me go. They could have taken me, could have pulled me down like the others, but they let me run, like they were testing, like they wanted to see what I would do, like I was being observed. I documented everything, my stylus scratching across parchment with mechanical precision while my mind recoiled from the implications. When I finished, the monitors took Vex away to the Medicae station. I never saw him again. The official report listed him as psychologically compromised by combat stress and reclassified to limited duty pending recovery. But I knew he would not recover. Could not recover. Because what he had witnessed could not be unseen, and the knowledge it carried was more destructive than any physical wound. The shapes he described were not hypothetical anymore, not rumors or atmospheric aberrations or hallucinations induced by fear. They were real, present, hunting in the ruins around our hive with intelligence and purpose, and they were playing with us. More bodies appeared over the following days, or what remained of bodies. They were found in the outer districts, in maintenance tunnels, in abandoned sections where surveillance coverage was incomplete. The Medicae reports documented injuries that defied conventional understanding. Drained. That was the word they used. The corpses were drained of fluid, their tissues soft and partially dissolved, their bones showing premature degradation as if they had been soaked in some chemical agent that broke down their structural integrity. They looked deflated, like empty containers that had held something precious that was now extracted. The bodies' positions suggested they had been arranged, displayed, left where they would be found, positioned with care that indicated intelligence rather than animalistic feeding. Some lay in patterns that hurt to perceive directly, geometric configurations that suggested meaning without quite communicating it. Messages, perhaps, or warnings, or simply artistic expression from minds so alien that their aesthetics triggered revulsion in human observers. The air changed. Everyone in the refuge felt it, though few could articulate what had shifted. It carried a new taste, metallic, sharp, vibrating with frequencies that made teeth ache and skin crawl. People described it as wrong air, as breathing that tasted like fear, as atmosphere that carried the presence of something vast and hungry pressing closer. The hive's ventilation systems struggled. The machine spirits that regulated atmospheric processing began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior, cycling between extremes of temperature and humidity, sometimes flooding sections with air so hot it was painful to breathe, sometimes dropping temperatures until frost formed on metal surfaces. The tech priests dispatched to address the malfunctions returned shaken, reporting that the machine spirits were responding to external stimuli, detecting presences in the air itself, things that moved through ventilation shafts too small for human bodies, things that left residue on filters that analysis could not identify. On the 8th day, I heard them myself. I was processing casualty reports in a quiet corner of the refuge when the sound began, a distant shrieking that echoed through the ventilation shafts above us. Not human, not mechanical. Something organic, but utterly wrong. voices that operated in registers that suggested throat structures incompatible with human anatomy. The sound reverberated through the caves, bouncing off stone walls, creating harmonics that made consciousness feel unstable. People covered their ears and whimpered. Children screamed. The elderly simply closed their eyes, faces set with the acceptance of those who had lived too long and no longer feared death. The shrieking continued for hours, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close, as if whatever made the sound was moving through the hive's infrastructure, exploring passages and chambers, learning our architecture, mapping our refuge with patient thoroughness, testing us, tasting us, preparing for what came next. The shadows in the refuge began to move, not dramatically, not obviously, but I noticed, and others noticed, though most refused to acknowledge what they saw. The shadows cast by our bodies and the emergency lumen strips would sometimes shift independently, would extend or contract in ways that did not correspond to the light source, would occasionally form shapes that suggested limbs or appendages or structures that human bodies did not possess. I watched my own shadow one night and saw it ripple, saw something pass through it like a stone dropped into water, saw it momentarily sprout additional protrusions before settling back into the familiar human silhouette. The Tyranids were already here. Not physically present, not yet, but present in some other way, their awareness penetrating our refuge, their hunger tasting the air we breathed, their vast collective intelligence learning everything about us while we huddled in darkness and pretended depth provided safety. We were being studied, catalogued, assessed with the cold precision of something that saw flesh not as life but as resource, that measured us in terms of proteins and minerals and genetic material waiting to be reclaimed. The devouring had not yet begun, but the appetite had arrived, and in the darkness of the refuge, surrounded by the smell of fear and the sound of distant shrieking and the movement of shadows that should not move, I understood that we were already inside the predator's mouth. We were just waiting for it to swallow. The sky broke on the 11th day. I was not there to witness it directly. We remained buried in the refuge caves, isolated from the hive's surface by kilometers of stone and metal. But I felt it. Everyone felt it. A pressure shift so sudden and violent that ears popped, that caused the stone around us to groan with a sound like breaking bones, that made the air itself feel heavy as if atmosphere had transformed into something denser, more substantial. Then the Vox horns activated. Emergency broadcast. Maximum priority. The voice that emerged was barely recognizable as human, distorted by interference, fractured by static that suggested the transmission itself was being corrupted by whatever it described. Atmospheric breach detected. Multiple impact sites across outer districts, defensive batteries engaging, all defense force units to combat stations. Shelter protocols remain in effect. Do not attempt to. The transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a sound like screaming. Not human screaming, something else. Something that used the Vox network to emit noise that made consciousness feel fragile, that caused nosebleeds among listeners, that forced people to cover their ears, even though the sound came from speakers, rather than approaching physically. The refuge erupted into chaos. People scrambled to their feet, driven by instinct to flee, even though there was nowhere to go. Children wailed. Adults shouted questions at the monitors, who responded with shock mauls and threats because they had no answers, because they were as terrified as everyone else, because the administratum had not prepared them for this moment, despite knowing it would come. I remained seated against the stone wall, my data slate clutched in trembling hands, and listened to the sounds filtering through the hive's infrastructure. Distant thunder that was not thunder weapons fire, massive defensive batteries discharging with rhythmic precision, alarms cycling through different warning protocols. And beneath it all, the shrieking I had heard in the ventilation shafts, now amplified 1,000-fold, now flooding the entire hive with the voices of things that should not possess voices. The Defense Force officer stationed in our refuge received a garbled transmission on his personal Vox unit. He listened for perhaps 10 seconds before his face went completely white. He turned to the senior monitor and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. But in the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd, everyone heard. Spore drop, thousands of them, raining down across the outer districts. They're screaming. The spores are screaming as they fall. Batteries are destroying hundreds, but there are too many. They're hitting the surface and breaking open, and what comes out? He stopped, could not continue, simply stood there with his Vox unit still transmitting sounds of distant battle, of weapons, fire and explosions, and that terrible shrieking that had become the soundtrack to our annihilation. Hours passed in agony. We received no further official transmissions. The Vox network had collapsed or been abandoned, or been overwhelmed by interference that turned every channel into howling static. The Defense Force officer's personal unit continued to receive fragmentary signals from other units, brief bursts of communication before those units went silent forever. Can't hold the barricades, they're coming through the... Need reinforcements at Sector 9 immediately, casualties are. Emperor save us, they're inside the walls there. Each transmission ended in screaming or weapons fire, or simply silence, as abrupt as death. The tremors intensified. No longer distant footsteps but present violence, the sensation of impacts transmitted through stone, of explosions and collapses, and massive weights striking the Hive's superstructure. The refuge's ceiling shed dust with each tremor, creating a grey snow that coated everything, that got into lungs and eyes, that made breathing an act of conscious effort. Then the first clouds reached us. Not physically, the refuge was sealed, the entrance barricaded by the monitors who had orders to prevent anyone from leaving, even if they begged. But through the ventilation system, carried by the recycled air that was our only connection to the Hive above, came something new. Smoke. But not from fire. This was acrid, chemical, wrong in ways that made eyes water and throats close. It carried particles that sparkled faintly in the lumen strip's light, that looked almost beautiful until you realized they were alive, microscopic organisms floating in the air, landing on skin and clothing and exposed surfaces. Spores. The same ones that had rained on the Hive's surface, now filtering down through kilometers of infrastructure, finding their way into the deepest shelters, despite all the administratum's promises of safety. People began coughing, then vomiting, then collapsing as their bodies reacted to contamination that no Medici protocol had prepared them for. The monitors tried to maintain order, but they were breathing the same air, inhaling the same spores, their bodies already beginning the slow process of corruption. I pressed cloth against my face, useless gesture, symbolic resistance, and watched as the refuge transformed into something worse than tomb. People writhed on the stone floor, their skin developing rashes that spread with visible speed, their eyes streaming fluids that were not quite tears, their mouths emitting sounds that suggested their vocal cords were being reshaped by whatever the spores carried. A child near me, no more than 5 years old, clutching a worn toy, looked at me with eyes that had started to change color, that showed the beginning stages of something alien taking root in flesh too young to resist. She opened her mouth to speak, but what emerged was not language. Just a wet clicking sound, like chitin rubbing against chitin, like something insectoid trying to communicate through human throat. Her mother screamed and pulled her close, as if embrace could protect against contamination that had already taken hold, as if love could reverse biology that was being rewritten by forces that existed beyond human comprehension. The Defense Force officer's Vox unit emitted one final transmission. This one was clear, the words distinct, despite the chaos audible in the background. Outer districts fallen. Inner Hive breached at multiple points, defensive lines collapsed. Requesting orbital bombardment of the following coordinates. A pause, then a different voice, higher in authority, heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. Request denied, population centers still occupied, continue resistance with available forces, the Emperor protects. There are no available forces, there is no resistance. They are inside the walls, inside the Hive, inside everything. We need purification from orbit, or there will be nothing left to our... Static, then silence, then the distant sound of something massive collapsing, transmitted through stone as vibration that made the entire refuge shake. The ceiling began to crack. Not the small fractures we had seen in the walls, but fundamental structural failure. Fissures opened overhead, branching like lightning, shedding chunks of stone that crashed among the panicking crowd. The lumen strips flickered and died, plunging us into darkness broken only by emergency chemolites and the faint bioluminescence of the spores that now coated every surface. In that diseased glow, I saw the truth of what was happening. This was not battle, not war in any conventional sense. This was harvest. The Tyranids were not invading, they were processing. Everything they touched, everything their spores contaminated, everything their living storm enveloped was being transformed, broken down, prepared for consumption. The hive above us was being digested, and we, buried in our refuge, were simply the last course of a meal that had already begun. People ran for the barricaded entrance, throwing themselves against barriers that would not yield, screaming for release, even though release meant exposure to horrors that were worse than confinement. The monitors tried to stop them, but many had already fallen to the spores, were writhing on the ground, clutching throats that no longer functioned properly, skin that bubbled and reformed in patterns that suggested it was being repurposed. The Defense Force officer drew his sidearm. For a moment I thought he would use it to maintain order. Instead, he placed it against his own temple and fired. The shot echoed in the refuge like thunder, like punctuation, like the final word in a sentence that had always ended this way. His body hit the stone with the empty sound of meat dropping, and no one moved to help, because help was a concept that had lost meaning, because we were all already dead and simply had not yet stopped moving. The ceiling groaned. Dust became rain. The cracks widened until I could see darkness beyond them, not the darkness of unlit space, but the darkness of something vast pressing against the other side, something that desired entrance, that tested our shelter's integrity with patient thoroughness. Around me, people dissolved into chaos or prayer or silent acceptance. Some held loved ones, some clutched their pathetic treasures. Some simply sat and stared at nothing while their bodies slowly betrayed them, while the spores rewrote them cell by cell. And I, with my data slate still clutched in hands that had developed a faint tremor, continued to document, continued to record. Because the administratum had trained me to believe that documentation mattered, that recording events gave them meaning, that if everything was properly filed, then somehow order could be maintained, even as reality collapsed into horror. The storm of living hunger had arrived. Not armies, not soldiers, not enemies that could be fought with weapons and courage, but appetite. Pure, vast, inevitable appetite that saw cities as meals and populations as ingredients, and entire worlds as resources waiting to be claimed. We were inside that appetite now, and it was beginning to digest. The barriers fell within hours. Not gradually, suddenly, catastrophically, as if the universe had decided resistance was taking too long and simply erased the obstacles. I heard it through the stone, through the groaning infrastructure of the dying hive, the sound of metal tearing, of ferrocrete crumbling, of defenses that had stood for centuries collapsing like structures made of ash. The vox horns gave one final transmission before dying completely. A voice I did not recognize, raw with exhaustion and terror, delivering the last official communication the hive would ever make. All defensive positions compromised. Retreat to secondary lines. Repeat, retreat to no, they're already there, they're in the weapons fire. So much weapons fire, the sound became continuous, became white noise, became the texture of annihilation. Then screaming. Then something worse than screaming, wet sounds, tearing sounds, the audio signature of bodies being dismantled while still alive. Then nothing. The vox horns fell silent and did not activate again. The administratum's voice, which had narrated our lives with endless pronouncements and protocols, had spoken its last word. We were alone now, buried in darkness, waiting. The ceiling finally collapsed on the 12th day. I felt it coming seconds before it happened, a pressure shift, a sensation like the air being sucked away, a moment of perfect silence, as if the universe held its breath. Then the stone gave way, not above the main refuge chamber that would have killed everyone instantly. Instead, the collapse came at the northern edge, where the ceiling had been thinnest, where the cracks had opened widest. Tons of rock and metal crashed down, crushing perhaps 20 people beneath debris, filling the air with dust so thick it became impossible to breathe without choking. But worse than the collapse itself was what came through the breach. Light, not the clean illumination of lumen strips, but something diseased, purple-tinged, pulsing with the same rhythm as the corrupted sky. It poured through the opening like liquid, like something with substance and will, and where it touched the spore-contaminated surfaces they began to writhe, to grow, to transform into something that was no longer stone or metal but organic, living matter. and with the light came the sounds. Clicking, skittering, the scrape of chitin against rock, the wet breathing of things that should not breathe. And underneath it all, a sound like humming, not mechanical but biological, the vibration of countless organisms communicating in frequencies that made human teeth ache and bones resonate with sympathetic vibration. They were coming. The monitors abandoned their posts, simply dropped their shock mauls, and ran deeper into the refuge, pushing through the crowd without concern for who they trampled. Their authority had evaporated the moment the ceiling broke, the moment it became clear that all the Imperium's protocols and threats and hierarchies were irrelevant in the face of what descended. I watched the breach. Could not look away despite every instinct screaming to flee. Watched as shapes began to emerge from the opening silhouettes that moved wrong, that had too many limbs or not enough, that seemed to shift and flow like liquid made solid, like nightmares given physical form. The first one dropped into the refuge with horrible grace. It was perhaps 3 meters long, low to the ground, its body segmented and covered in plates that looked like they had been designed rather than evolved. Multiple limbs, I counted 6 before losing track, each tipped with blades or hooks or appendages whose function I could not guess. Its head was eyeless, but I felt it see me anyway, felt it register my presence with senses that operated beyond vision. It made a sound. A clicking chirp that might have been communication, or might have been the audio equivalent of tasting, of sampling the air to determine what chemicals my fear sweat contained, what information my scent provided about my biology. Then it moved. Fast, impossibly fast. One moment it perched at the edge of the breach, the next it was among the crowd, moving through panicking humans like a harvester through grain. Its blades flashed. People fell. Not dead, not immediately. The creature was precise, surgical, cutting with deliberate care to disable rather than kill, to preserve rather than destroy. A man went down clutching a leg that ended at the knee, the cut so clean the wound barely bled. A woman collapsed with her arm severed at the shoulder, her face showing shock rather than pain, her nervous system not yet registering what had happened. An elderly priest fell with his abdomen opened in a line so straight it looked like someone had drawn it with a ruler, his intestines spilling in a controlled fashion that suggested purpose rather than violence. The creature was harvesting, preparing, rendering us down into components while keeping us alive because living biomass was more valuable than dead tissue. More shapes dropped through the breach. Dozens of them. Each slightly different, suggesting specialization. Suggesting a hierarchy of function within the swarm. Some were smaller, faster, skittering across walls and ceiling with adhesive limbs. Some were larger, armored, moving with the patient confidence of apex predators. Some were wrong in ways I could not articulate. Their geometry suggested dimensions that should not intersect with our reality. Their movements implied physics that contradicted the materium's basic laws. The refuge became an abattoir. Not through slaughter but through systematic processing. The creatures moved through the crowd with methodical efficiency, selecting victims according to criteria I could not determine. Some people they killed instantly, mercy, perhaps, or simple triage, determining that certain individuals were not worth preserving. Others they incapacitated with precise strikes that left them alive but immobile, paralyzed by severed nerves or shock or venom delivered through those hooked appendages. And some they simply touched. A brush of a blade-tipped limb across exposed skin, so quick it barely registered. But where they touched, changes began. The flesh would ripple, would develop patterns that suggested something rewriting it at the cellular level, would begin the slow transformation into something that was no longer entirely human. I saw a woman collapse after such a touch, her body convulsing as her skin took on a grey-green cast, as her bones audibly cracked and reformed, as her face stretched and compressed in ways that suggested her skull was being reshaped from within. She was still alive, still conscious. Her eyes met mine, and I saw awareness there, saw the terrible knowledge that she was experiencing her own transformation, that she would remain conscious while her body betrayed everything it had been. A child, the same one who had looked at me with changing eyes, was lifted gently by one of the creatures, not crushed, not torn apart, simply held, examined with appendages that might have been sensory organs, then carried toward the breach with something approaching care. She did not scream, made no sound at all, simply hung limp in the creature's grasp, like she had accepted her fate, like her young mind had already understood what we adults refused to acknowledge. This was not cruelty, not torture, not even hostility in any conventional sense. This was biology, pure function. The Tyranids were not evil, they were appetite, and appetite has no moral dimension. They consumed because consumption was their nature, their purpose, their reason for existing. And we, trapped in this refuge, were simply nutrients that happened to be conscious during processing. I backed against the far wall, pressed into a corner where the stone met stone, and watched the harvest continue. People ran, people hid, people fought with improvised weapons or bare hands. Nothing mattered. The creatures were patient, thorough, inevitable. They would process everyone eventually. There was no escape, no resistance would succeed, no prayer would be answered. The hive above was already gone, I understood that now. The sounds filtering through the breach were not battle but digestion. The Tyranids were not invading the hive's levels, they were consuming them, breaking down walls and floors and ceilings into organic matter that could be repurposed, that could become new creatures, new spores, new vectors of consumption. The entire hive was being transformed, rendered down, reclaimed, and we were the final harvest. An officer, one of the Defense Force personnel who had tried to maintain order, made a last stand near the center of the chamber. He had retained his las rifle, was firing in controlled bursts at the creatures that approached. His shots were accurate. Several creatures fell, their chitin cracked and smoking, but for every one he killed, 3 more appeared through the breach. For every second he delayed them, 10 more people were taken. He fought until his power cell depleted. Then he drew his combat knife and charged, screaming prayers to the Emperor, believing even now that faith and courage could matter, that human determination could prevail. A larger creature intercepted him mid-charge. Its appendage, something between a tentacle and a blade, speared through his chest with such speed he did not immediately understand what had happened. He looked down at the chitin protruding from his torso, looked up at the creature's eyeless face, opened his mouth to speak. The creature lifted him off the ground, held him there while his legs kicked weakly. Then, with deliberate care, began to pull him apart. Not tearing, separating, dismantling him joint by joint, bone by bone, keeping him alive through the process with techniques that suggested intimate knowledge of human anatomy. His screaming lasted longer than seemed possible. I turned away, could not watch, pressed my face against the cold stone and felt my consciousness begin to fracture, felt sanity become negotiable, felt the boundaries of self dissolving, because witnessing this was beyond what human minds were designed to process. Around me, the harvest continued, methodical, patient, complete. The Tyranids worked without pause, without hurry, with the confidence of creatures that had consumed thousands of worlds and would consume thousands more. We were not special, not chosen, not particularly interesting. We were simply here. And being here made us food. The sounds of the hive's death filtered through the breach collapses, explosions, the shrieking of organisms that had no terrestrial equivalent. The entire structure was failing, not from battle damage but from systematic deconstruction, from being rendered down into component materials. I do not remember when I stopped being afraid. At some point, fear became exhausted, burned through its fuel and left only hollow acceptance. I sat against the stone and watched the creatures work and felt nothing except a distant curiosity about when they would reach me, what method they would use, whether I would remain conscious during processing. The refuge ceiling groaned. More sections began to collapse. Purple light flooded in from multiple breaches now, illuminating a scene that would have been beautiful if it were not horrific. The creatures moving through dust and bodies with alien grace, their chitinous forms catching the diseased light, creating shadows that danced across walls that were no longer entirely stone. The harvest was nearly complete. Soon they would reach me. Soon I would join the biomass. Soon there would be nothing left of this hive, except organic material being transported through vast living conduits to whatever digestive processes awaited. I clutched my data slate, useless habit, meaningless gesture, and waited for appetite to find me. It would not be long now. I write this in the ruins of what was once a hive of 12 billion souls. The refuge collapsed fully on the 13th day. Not from structural failure, from purpose. The Tyranids had finished their harvest and no longer required the chamber to remain intact. The stone simply gave way, dissolved by acids or broken down by organisms too small to see, and the walls that had promised safety crumbled like dreams confronting reality. I survived. Not through skill or courage or divine intervention. I survived because the creatures had not yet processed me when the collapse came, because I fell through the debris into a maintenance tunnel that the harvest had not yet reached, because in the chaos of digestion I became temporarily overlooked. Temporarily. That is the key word. There is no escape. Only delay. I crawled through the tunnel, through darkness broken by bioluminescent growths that pulsed with the rhythm of something enormous breathing. The walls were no longer ferrocrete, they had been transformed into something organic, ribbed and wet, contracting with peristaltic motion that suggested I was moving through the digestive tract of something vast. The air was thick with spores, each breath coating my lungs with contamination that I could feel spreading through my tissues, rewriting me slowly from within. I emerged into what had been Administrative District 7. I recognized the location by the archway now partially dissolved that had once marked the entrance to the distribution center where I had served for 17 years. Everything else was gone. Not destroyed, consumed. The buildings had been rendered down to their base materials, the metal extracted and repurposed, the stone broken into minerals, the human construction erased so thoroughly it was as if the Imperium had never existed here. In its place was the hive mind's architecture. Organic spires rose where hab blocks had stood, their surfaces covered in what might have been skin or bark or chitin. I could not tell, could not process the alien biology with categories my education had provided. They pulsed with internal movement, suggesting they were not structures but organisms, living things that served functions I could not begin to understand. Between the spires stretched membranes, vast sheets of translucent tissue suspended on frameworks of bone or cartilage. They rippled in wind that carried the stench of digestion, of acids breaking down matter, of biology operating at scales that made human cities seem like children's toys. And everywhere, the creatures moved. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. More variations than I could count, each specialized for some function in the greater organism. Small ones skittered across surfaces, tending to growths that might have been food sources or waste processing, or something my limited understanding could not categorize. Larger ones hauled masses of material processed biomass, I realized with sick certainty, toward pits that pulsed with light and heat, toward what might have been digestive organs operating at the scale of city blocks. Flying things circled overhead, their wings too thin to support their mass through conventional aerodynamics, moving instead through principles that suggested they manipulated gravity or air pressure in ways that violated physics as I understood it. They carried objects in grasping limbs, some I recognized as human remains, some as chunks of building material, some as writhing masses that might still have been alive. I watched one creature deposit its cargo into a pit, watched the biomass sink into fluid that bubbled and steamed, watched the matter dissolve, watched it be broken down into component elements, watched those elements get drawn away through pulsing tubes toward purposes I could only imagine. This was the harvest's end stage, the consumption. The transformation of everything a hive had been into raw material for the swarm's continued existence. And in the distance, dominating the skyline where the Administratum's central tower had once stood, I saw them. Bioships. They hovered above the hive's ruins, vast beyond comprehension, their forms suggesting both biological growth and deliberate design. They were kilometers long. I had no frame of reference adequate to judge their true size. Their surfaces moved, not with the motion of machines, but with the contraction of muscles, with the pulse of circulatory systems, with the breathing of things that were both vessels and creatures. Tendrils extended from their undersides, vast organic tubes that connected to the feeding pits below, that drew processed biomass upward in visible streams. I watched the material flow, watched the wealth of an entire world being siphoned into those hovering organisms, watched the physical substance of human civilization become fuel for something that existed only to consume. The sky above them was no longer purple. It had darkened to bruise black, thick with spores and flying organisms, completely occluding whatever stars might exist beyond. This was the hive mind's sky now. The atmosphere itself had been claimed, transformed into an environment optimized for Tyranid biology rather than human survival. I walked through the ruins. Not with purpose, purpose had become obsolete. I walked because stopping meant acknowledging finality, meant accepting that movement was futile, meant surrendering to the certainty that death was not minutes but seconds away. I passed corpses. Not many, most biomass had already been processed, but some remained, perhaps judged unsuitable for consumption, perhaps simply overlooked in the vast efficiency of harvest. They lay in positions that suggested their final moments, reaching toward exits that no longer existed, clutching loved ones who had been taken while they were left behind, curled in positions that suggested they had tried to make themselves small enough to hide. I recognized some faces. Workers I had distributed rations to, clerks I had filed reports with, people who had lived ordinary lives of quiet desperation under the Imperium's suffocating bureaucracy, who had believed their obedience and faith would be rewarded with protection. They had been wrong, as we had all been wrong. The Emperor had not protected, the Administratum's protocols had not mattered, the Defense Force's courage had been irrelevant. In the end, everything humanity had built, everything we had believed, everything we had sacrificed for, had dissolved before appetite that recognized no authority except its own hunger. I found my old workstation in the ruins of the distribution center. The ferrocrete walls had been partially dissolved, creating an opening where I could see inside. The gruel vats were gone, consumed or repurposed. The data slates and parchment and all the endless documentation of the Administratum had been reduced to organic sludge that fed growths I could not name. But my desk remained, somehow overlooked. I sat at it, absurd gesture, meaningless ritual, and placed my data slate on its surface. The device still functioned, somehow. Its machine spirit had survived when so many others had failed, had persisted through contamination and chaos to fulfill its basic purpose. Recording, documenting, bearing witness. I began to write. Not a report, the Administratum was gone, and there was no authority to receive my testimony. Not a prayer, I had no faith left, no belief that anyone cared about our suffering, just words. An accounting. The final document of a hive that had been counted, processed, consumed. The sound of bones cracking reached me as I wrote. Somewhere nearby, in one of the feeding pits, the harvest continued, human skeletons being broken down for their calcium, their marrow, their minerals, reduced to component elements that would become chitin and tissue and new organisms that would travel to new worlds and consume new populations. We were not the first, would not be the last. The Great Devourer had consumed countless civilizations before humanity existed and would continue long after humanity was extinct. We were simply nutrients, temporarily organized in patterns that gave us the illusion of individuality, of purpose, of meaning. But the universe was hungry, and hunger did not care about our illusions. I felt the spores working inside me, felt my lungs changing, adapting, becoming better suited to processing the transformed atmosphere. Felt my cells being rewritten, my DNA being edited by organisms so small they operated at molecular scales. I was being consumed from within, slowly converted into something that would serve the hive mind's purposes. The shadow of something enormous fell across my desk. I looked up to see one of the larger creatures approaching, the same species that had dismantled the Defense Force officer in the refuge. It moved with patient certainty, having detected my presence, having identified me as overlooked biomass requiring processing. I did not run. There was nowhere to run. The entire hive was the swarm's territory now. The entire planet would be consumed within weeks. The entire system would be stripped of organic material, leaving behind only dead rock, orbiting a star that would provide no warmth to worlds without life. The creature stopped before my desk. Its eyeless head tilted, examining me with senses I could not comprehend. It made a sound, clicking, chirping that might have been communication, or might have been the equivalent of laughter at finding a human still clinging to bureaucratic ritual, even as extinction approached. I looked at my data slate, at the words I had written, at this final accounting that documented not just a hive's death but the truth the Imperium had hidden beneath layers of propaganda and false hope. We were never safe. Never protected, never more than biomass waiting to be claimed by something hungrier than ourselves. The creature's blade appendage rose. I watched it with distant curiosity, wondering if the cut would be quick, whether I would remain conscious during processing, whether whatever replaced my neurons would retain any fragment of memory about who I had been. The blade descended, and in that final moment before it struck, I felt the hive mind's presence not as invasion but as recognition. Vast, ancient, patient beyond human comprehension. It had consumed entire galaxies' worth of biomass, had witnessed civilizations rise and fall and be forgotten, had reduced complexity to simplicity to fuel its endless migration through space. It knew me, not as an individual, that level of detail was irrelevant, but as a pattern, a configuration of proteins and memories and consciousness that was about to be dissolved, processed, transformed into components that would serve greater purposes than I had ever achieved as Merrick Voss, Scribe Adept 3rd Class. I had been counted, not as a person, as biomass. I had been processed, not as an enemy, as nutrients. I had been consumed, not out of malice, out of hunger that existed beyond morality, beyond hate, beyond anything except pure biological imperative. This is what happens when the Great Devourer comes. Not war, not invasion, not evil, just appetite. Vast, inevitable, eternal. If these words survive, if somehow this data slate escapes the harvest, if someone finds it in the ruins and reads this accounting, let them stand as testimony. We were not defeated, we were digested. We were not conquered, we were consumed. We were not destroyed. We were transformed into something else, something that would carry fragments of what we were to new worlds, new populations, new harvests. The Imperium lied. The Emperor did not protect. Humanity's dominion was always temporary, and in the end, we were all just biomass, waiting to be reclaimed.